Hello, and welcome to episode 100 of the Property Management Show.
Yes! And it's brought to you by 4.5, a marketing agency that creates and implements owner lead generating plans for property management companies.
We handle all aspects of owner marketing, from creating a conversion-driven website, nurturing leads, reputation management, social media content creation, online ads, you name it. Visit 4andhalf.com to learn more.
Today's guest is going to talk about online rent payments and what market trends he's seen throughout the pandemic. Spoiler alert, it's not exactly what we thought it was going to be.
He'll also share his worst case and best case predictions of what will happen to the industry for the remainder of 2020 and possibly leading into 2021. So here is our interview with Dave Spooner from Innago. So Dave, thank you so much for making time to be a guest on our podcast today. To start things off, in an earlier conversation we had with you, you mentioned that surprisingly, despite what everyone kind of predicted, the number of rent payments that are delinquent hasn't been as bad, but you would have more visibility since you work with a lot more landlords across the nation. What would you say about that, and kind of any insights as to why is it kind of insulated from all the crazy stuff happening?
Right. Yeah. And first of all, thanks so much for having me, guys. I'm really excited to be here. When we had first kind of discussed, I think our plan was to talk about delinquencies. And surprisingly, when we dig into the data, we find that that's not really the narrative here.
Mm-hmm.
Rent is, for the most part, getting paid, and getting paid as close to on time as it typically does. Now, there's certainly variation there, but for the most part, it's within that normal ballpark. I think there's predominantly a couple different things that are happening here. First of all, landlords have chosen to make a lot of concessions to ensure that whatever rent they can collect, they are able to collect. There's of course an eviction moratorium in place right now. There was first the one laid out nationwide, and then there was the CDC one that followed up. Landlords know that they don't have a lot of recourse here. So they're just trying to collect what they can. And in doing so, I've seen a variety of different plans. We see landlords that are reducing the total rent that tenants are paying each month. We've seen landlords take a month of rent and spread it out over the course of the next 12 months, for example. We've seen people give direct credit to their tenants just to play ball a little bit and help them out and help them get what they can paid. Landlords are working alongside their tenants here. So the net rent being collected is certainly down. There's no doubt about it. But tenants being delinquent, the percentage of the whole is really not up in any meaningful way, which is encouraging in a way for the market that it's found a way to adapt pretty rapidly to a lot of adversity here with COVID.
And that's so interesting. You mentioned a couple of things. So total net rent is lower, but in terms of no rent collected, it's not as bad as everyone thought. And so, in a sense of landlords are working more with their tenants to try to work something out just so some money is paid.
Sure.
What role does the property manager play in that space? Do you find that these efforts are initiated by the individual landlords, or are the property managers the ones approaching the landlords, for example, and coming up with kind of a way to make both parties happy?
Right. Absolutely. And I often speak about property managers and landlords interchangeably, right? Because you've got some that operate in both spaces. I would say that from a property management standpoint, it's definitely being initiated by the property managers, right? It's not being initiated by the owners, the investor. Of course, owners want to be as hands off as possible. They want to say, hey, get me my rent, have the check show up, and I'm all happy. But a proactive property manager should really be reaching out to those owners and kind of navigating them through uncharted waters here, and just explain to them, hey, here's our situation. Here's what we, are, to some degree, if we have a bad renter, our backs are against the wall. We can't kick them out of the space because they haven't paid rent. So let's find a way to move forward here where we can still get mortgages paid. We can still get whatever income we can in here. Although we might have to take a slight reduction. And hopefully the owners are not over leveraged, that they can handle a bit of a shock here. And hopefully the property managers can retain as much of that portfolio as possible.
So you mentioned, reducing rent, payment plans, some types of credits. How much do you think that government aid has contributed to allowing people to pay rent and the delinquency numbers not falling off the charts?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's the second narrative to draw from here as far as why payments are still coming in, right? It's because the programs put in place for the most part worked, right? I mean, people got a $1,200 stimulus. A lot of people that are paying rent, at least people that are above that income bracket, oftentimes aren't paying rent anymore. They're homeowners. So people paying rent got that $1,200 stimulus check, sometimes two to a household. They maybe got unemployment, got the unemployment bonus. Those programs really did seem to assist households in covering their rental costs. It's not really easy for us to say how much, right? Because we don't know a ton about their income situation. But my guess is it was a pretty big part of the story there. So that's definitely a big piece of it. And I think those landlords that took action to try to offset some of the challenges with collecting rent and also had a clientele that were receiving those checks are in really good shape because they probably didn't have to make quite the number of concessions that maybe other landlords did and other property managers did.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm curious to know, right? So we're kind of talking in broad terms of like, in general, delinquency payments were not as bad as expected. Total rent collection was obviously down, but it's not kind of like the end of the world that everyone was expecting. Would you say there are specific geographical factors that affect that? Like, for example, if we average the whole US, this is the case, but are there pockets of the country that just have a completely different experience than others?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is big time. Which, I mean, that's how real estate is, right? Real estate is so localized. Each market is so unique. And you might find that your market is more impacted by COVID than others, or your market is more insulated against COVID than others. I think what we're seeing in broad strokes is that the large cities that have traditionally been employment magnets are the hardest hit. And it's not necessarily hit by delinquencies or even hit by rental concessions. The secondary thing to draw from this is occupancy is certainly down. It's down, it seems to be approximately 5%, which is significant. I mean, that's a big chunk. And it's in a lot of those markets like a San Jose or a San Francisco or a Boston or a New York, that typically people are coming from across the country to move there to get a job, maybe in a tech sector, for example. Well, now they can work from home. And a lot of people in, my generation, maybe they don't have kids yet, they're in their early 30s, late 20s. It's easy for them to move back in with mom and dad across the country for 6 months to 12 months. So they may choose to break that lease. They may not re-up for a new lease. So those markets are definitely feeling more of the impact from an occupancy standpoint than I think the rest of the country is.
So maybe the more expensive markets, like we're talking about bigger areas, but also dollar amount. So if sure. We even had a colleague recently move to Washington where she was living in, the Bay Area, much more expensive. So it's like you're working from home.
Right.
Why not move to somewhere beautiful with forests and oceans and pay less rent?
Right.
It makes a lot of sense. So have you seen a spike or or an increase in occupancy, I guess is the way to put it, for more affordable areas? Or is that kind of not very clear?
We haven't really, at least not anything noticeable. And that could be for a variety of different reasons. One is, as I mentioned, some people choosing to move back in home, right? So there's no new renter created there.
Or moving in with a friend that already has a home, something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe you take roommates. Maybe you thought, oh, finally I'm going to have my own place, and COVID happened and you said, well, maybe I'll put it off for a year, right? So you continue to rent with somebody else. So we're not seeing anything substantial. I think at the very least, the negative side is outweighing the positive side on that front.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of vacancies, do you see landlords or property managers doing any kinds of concessions to retain their tenants? If vacancy is a big issue, right? It's like, are there kind of special deals going on just to protect that, or nothing
bundles?
Yeah. I think that those ongoing concessions are what landlords are trying to do. To keep people in. I think that there's a natural inertia away from movement though, right? So for those markets that are reasonably priced, that are not the super expensive San Franciscos of the world, renters aren't if they're on a month-to-month lease, they're not getting up and saying, I got to go move now in the middle of this pandemic where it's difficult to do showings and, having movers come through your stuff and going and seeing different things. They don't want that exposure. So I think people are staying put more than before, and we are seeing less transition. We're also, I attended a kind of digital conference with that TransUnion hosted, and it was great. They brought in some people from across the industry to speak to what they were seeing, and it reflected a lot of what we're seeing at Innago as well. And one speaker from Radix, they collect data on predominantly showings and on leases that are getting signed, right, amongst other things too. But what they're seeing, which is interesting, because we don't have the leasing piece of it, we don't have the showing piece of it. They're seeing a sharp reduction in showings, but a much higher percentage of signings after showing, right? So people are seeing less apartments, and they're signing from less showing. So people just want to see one or two. They see, oh, this is a one bed, it's big enough, it's in a nice enough area. I'm just going to sign it. I'm not going to shop around and see every different apartment out there. So I think that's one of the changes that we're seeing as well, that people are trying to reduce the amount of searching that they're doing for apartments when they do need to find a new one.
It's interesting. So it seems like, renters are less shopping around as like, let's do every research we can without getting exposed, like maybe online. Right. And then we maybe just see the top two and then make a decision. Whereas before you can just go to any property that.
Right. Why not? Right.
Yeah. Right.
Well, and sometimes you had to because the market was so competitive,
right?
Like depending on the area. But if there are less people moving, there's more opportunity. I mean, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's exactly right. And a lot more landlords and property managers are starting to invest in showing software as well, right? To do digital showings, 3D tours. Maybe they do, a FaceTime or a Zoom with a bunch of people on it where they're showing around the apartment. So there is not as much physical interaction. So that's the other thing, is some of these showings maybe aren't getting identified as showings per se because they're not traditional showings. Maybe they're occurring digitally before somebody does go in person. Mm-hmm. So it's really changing and shifting the landscape of how showings are occurring and how property managers and landlords are managing their listings in general.
Yeah, and that makes sense too if they aren't if some people are counting the virtual showings as real showings, some people aren't.
Right.
But it also stands to reason that people might be, as Marie said a couple minutes ago, looking more online, but even those virtual tours save so much time. I mean, I remember I've been in the same apartment for almost 5 years, but I remember it was such a hassle trying to find a place to live because you want that perfect spot. And the market was so competitive at the time that you had to be first in the door if you wanted to get it.
Right.
So it's just so interesting how the state of the world can change something like that so significantly.
Right. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from COVID is that shocks like COVID, and it's a big shock, they accelerate trends within the market, right? Yeah. They make things happen faster than they're already happening. It's not that digital showing software didn't exist, and it's not that digital showing software wasn't becoming increasingly popular, but something like COVID creates an impetus for more people to use it, more people get exposed to it, more people like it. Now they say, well, you know what? Our first showing is always going to be through Zoom, right? We're just going to open up a link, 20 people can go in. Those people can choose to apply if they want to come and see it in person.
Yeah, it's almost like a job interview when you
exactly.
you do like a phone call and then the Zoom meeting and then in person.
Definitely.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I actually have a question, more kind of like looking forward, right? So we've talked about like what's happening now, and we're very near the close of 2020. I know everyone can't wait for this year to be over, but elections coming up, and in light of that, do you have any sort of best case or worst case scenario predictions that we could potentially see or expect for the last quarter of 2020, in terms of like, the property management industry or online rent payments?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I think the worst case, of course, is that COVID rears its ugly head in a significant way again, right? And that significant portions of the economy need to shut down. People are laid off again. And that coupled with no relief package, right? Because again, that happened in the first case. I mean, we had obviously record unemployment to a level we've never seen before because of COVID, and people were able to weather the storm because of the relief that was offered. So if those two things happen together, I do think we're ultimately going to see a problem with delinquencies, because I think that all the different things that we talked about here on the call, they help mitigate that impact for the landlords. But if that doesn't come, then I think we are going to see a sharp increase in delinquencies and a sharp increase in evictions whenever that's possible again. So that would be a worst case scenario. Hopefully that doesn't happen. I think a best case scenario is that, as I said, it just accelerates some of these processes that are more positive trends, right? More people doing digital showings, which makes both the landlord and property manager and the potential tenant's life easier. More people engaging in digital software for things like lease signing and online payments and tenant screening than were before. We're seeing an upward trend in that direction, which is great, which is exciting. Renters love that kind of thing. Landlords and property managers that have used it love that kind of thing. But this certainly could continue to accelerate that. So I would see that as the most positive. We get the market back to normal from a dollars and cents standpoint as quickly as possible, and we accelerate the kind of digital revolution that's occurring within the market.
What about 2021? Do you think is your prediction kind of the same thing, or do you see something different happening next year? I mean, there are a whole bunch of balls in the air, so
right.
Who knows which way it could go?
Exactly. That's the thing. Who knows which way? And I think it's going to depend in large part on the vaccine situation, how quickly that occurs. But I think that my answer pretty much holds true. If something, maybe we make it through the winter and it's not too bad, but then come spring of next year, COVID jumps up again, who knows? But if those things occur, that's where I see a challenge. If they don't occur, I do think that digitization trend is going to really continue.
And if it does go, for the worst case scenario, what do you see as a solution for property managers and landlords to continue keeping that delinquency number down? Do you think it's more aggressive concessions? Is that kind of the only alternative?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think to a large degree it is. I mean, I think that, landlords and real estate investors did not get a lot of direct assistance in the CARES Act or any subsequent legislation. They got a lot of indirect, right? Because renters were able to continue to make payments, but they didn't get a lot of direct assistance. And it may come to that. It may come to putting a moratorium on not just evictions, but on mortgage payments in general, right? So lobbying in that direction, if necessary. And there's a lot of great groups that are pushing for that kind of thing. But other than that, I would say continuing to make concessions, find out what your bottom line is. Where do you need to be to cover your expenses? What kind of kitty do you have set aside in case of something like this, where you do have issues having income and cash flow coming in? Those would be big ones. But this is really more than anything a lesson for the future, similar to what we saw in 2008. Don't over leverage yourself, right? Make sure that the income that you're getting from your properties well exceeds the mark you need to be in. Make sure that you're investing smartly, that as a property manager, you're taking on smart clients, right? That you're taking on properties that you can rent effectively. Don't take on a property where the owner of it is demanding $1,500 when the market bears $1,200, right? Don't rely on that as a source of income for you, because that's probably going to go away when there's a shock like this to the market. So I think the biggest takeaway is to just learn this lesson moving forward. And as long as you can weather this storm, take that in stride and try to invest and grow your business more intelligently in the future.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting when you talk about how, like, moving forward, one way to protect yourself is to, know your bottom line. Don't over leverage yourself. Don't take on a door just because it's a door.
Exactly.
Like, if you understand, so at 4.5, so we're, our podcast is by 4.5 and it's a marketing agency. So we always drill into everyone's minds that there's this concept of an ideal client, right? Like, in a perfect world, this ideal client gets you. Right.
Yeah. Makes you the most money for the least amount of stress.
And it's like, and it's funny how, like, it's not just for, marketing speak. It's also like, no, this is how you protect yourself when, black swan events like the pandemic happen. Totally. And then to go back to, kind of the topic of moving everything online, like, everyone was slowly trying to move online, like rent payments, showings, everything.
Right.
But like you said, everything has been accelerated. But obviously, it's still not 100% adoption, right? There are costs involved, right, to move everything online. So what would you say to property managers who kind of feel stuck? They're like, well, maybe COVID's almost over. I can just weather the storm out and I don't need to go online. But then, if everyone else moves online, then you're left behind, but then it requires some kind of initial investment. Like, what advice can you give to that kind of property manager listening to us right now?
Yeah. Well, I think that part of the market is really shifting. That it maybe doesn't require the same type of investment that it has in the past, right? Like the traditional players, we call them legacy players internally in Innago. And these are the folks like an Appfolio or a Yardi that I'm sure your listeners are really familiar with. These are great programs that served really, really well for a long time. They can be expensive, not just in the dollars invested, but the time invested to learn those platforms. But what we've seen in it, of course, as with all things real estate related, it's taken a little bit longer to get here for things in the property space. But we've seen more of this digital revolution touching on rental management software just as much as it's touching on other things throughout the economy. So we're seeing easier software. We're seeing software with less barriers to entry. Just as an example, to use Innago, we are free to use, right? And we're not the only one. You can find other platforms like it. And we put a premium on making our tools easy to use and easy to collaborate on. And if you do a little bit of digging as a landlord, as a property manager, if you try out a handful of different platforms, I think that landlords and property managers will be pleasantly surprised by what that small investment can return, and that the barrier to entry is not nearly as high as it once was. And what's a better time than now to give that a shot? I mean, can't be.
So talking about like going online, so it's one thing to bring like your operations online, but like the rent collection piece, right? So obviously there are processing fees that are involved when you have online payments. So I know for a fact the property manager who manages my apartment, they pass on like the processing fees to the tenants. And so maybe in markets like San Francisco, it's like it's a given, everyone's used to online payments, we don't mind paying for the extra convenience. But in other markets, maybe tenants would be turned off and not use the online platform. So what would you say is kind of like any kind of advice that you can give to a property manager who hasn't taken the plunge but is kind of like thinking of how to overcome that obstacle of who pays for the processing fee?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think this is a good opportunity to create a concession, and a pretty affordable concession at that, right? So, we have seen internally that when people start using our online payment platform, they typically see anywhere from a 20 all the way up to an 80% increase in the speed in which all of their rent is collected. So if normally it's all collected by the 5th, all of a sudden they start using our platform, it's all collected by, the 3rd, right? So it's happening faster. People tend to pay faster. There's reminder systems built in. There's a convenience factor there. The tenant can be sitting on the couch watching a movie. They get a notification. Hey, don't forget to pay rent. They click a button. It's paid. So you're going to have more people paying on time, right? The tenants love that convenience. They want to have that convenience. So a great concession to take to your tenants is to say, hey, we're offering this new platform, right? Whatever it is, where you can pay rent electronically and it's simple and easy to use. We're going to cover the fee for the next few months. There's a lot of platforms out there that have very low cost that even to the landlord or property manager or even to the tenant, if it's passed on to them, it's nothing insurmountable, but the property manager or landlord can take that on for a few months during COVID. They can even position it as, we're trying to reduce contact here. We're trying to keep you safe as renters. We're also trying to add some convenience to your life. We're going to take this cost on and you can pay for free. After a handful of months, we're probably going to pass that fee back to you. And they can flip that switch when the time comes. But at that point, the tenants will have had experience with it. They'll understand and recognize the value in it, right? They'll see the convenience. They'll say, hey, this was a lot better. I'm going to keep paying online, even if it's $1 or $2 or whatever, to pay online now moving forward. So I would look at it in that way. I would try to create that concession and add value and bring value to the tenants without costing too much on my side as a property manager or landlord.
I want to dig into this a little bit more because I'm curious. So what why does the tenant need to know about the processing fee? Is it something that has to be obvious in a platform, or and how much is a processing fee? Typically it's, is it like 3.5%, something like a bank processing fee? Because if you think about it, you think of these programs, like Best Buy is always an example that comes up, where it's like, you pay Geek Squad or whatever it's called these days, a premium amount, or I don't know if it's premium's the right word, but you pay them a premium, and no matter what is wrong with your computer, you pay that same price. So wouldn't that stand to reason that you could just factor in those processing fees into the rent without the tenant necessarily being aware of it? Because when Marie said, to pay online, I don't care about the processing fees, we're used to it. Of course, somebody's going to care if they're logging into a portal and they're about to pay, however much. Exactly. But if it's a few dollars every month, why not just raise the rent by $5 across the board? Is there a huge barrier to doing that?
No, that's a very good point. And I think it actually is part of the reason it's a great concession. What I mean by that is, for new tenants, when I talk to landlords and property managers, I encourage them to handle it in exactly that way. Simply raise the rent if you're going to eat the fee yourself.
Yeah.
Just raise it. They won't know the difference. Nobody's going to be like, this one bedroom is $1,000. This one's $1,005. I'm going with the $1,000 one, right? That's not how they're making their decision. It's just $5. And in our case, it's a maximum of $2 on a bank.
Great.
So it's not much. The real question is for existing tenants, and how do you want to manage that? And you don't have to let them know. You could just say, we're going to take the fee on. We're not even going to tell the tenants about it. We're just going to offer them this way to pay online, and they'll be fine, and they can go in and pay, and we'll eat the $2 fee in this case, and all will be good. But if you did want to try to migrate over to having the tenants pay it in the future, that would be the point at which you'd say, like, hey, we're going to cover it for a few months, and then we'll pass it back on you. But you're totally right. You don't have to show any convenience
rent all at once. Yeah,
exactly.
That makes
you can't just all of a sudden be like, we signed a contract, but it's going to be another $5.
That would be that would be an issue. Like, why am I signing a new agreement? What is this $5 for? That's when people ask questions. That makes a lot of sense.
Sure. But you could, by the same token, if you're planning on reducing rent by $100 for the next 6 months, you don't necessarily have to tell them, and instead you could reduce it by $95 or whatever, right? So you could kind of bake it into whatever other concessions you're putting in place to deal with some of the delinquency issues in COVID.
Totally.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So do you have any final takeaways for our audience today? I know we covered a lot.
Yeah, we did cover a lot. I would just say, be diligent about your business as always. Be focused in your business. Try to be creative. There's people on the other side. Tenants also have a lot of stresses, right? Just as many as you have as a landlord. The reason that they may be having trouble paying rent, the reason that your occupancy might be down, is because other people have a lot of stresses in their life. And be empathetic to that. Understand that. Work with your tenants, and hopefully you've attracted good tenants through empathy in the past, and because of that, you'll be able to get through it together. But I do think it's going to require people to work together, especially if some of those more worst case scenario types of issues occur. So I encourage landlords and property managers to just pay attention to their tenants, work with their tenants, talk to their tenants, make it a communal thing more than anything.
Yeah. And it is an interesting shift, because it's like, historically, the property manager has been hired to be the bad guy, because a landlord, it's easy to get emotional when you're dealing with somebody, but it's easy to get emotional in any circumstance, but at least you have a little bit more leverage to stick to the rules. If you say, not my rules, I just work for the owner. But in this situation, the framework has to change a little bit. And it's just an interesting change to the narrative that we're so used to hearing.
Yeah, we always tell landlords and property managers, you actually don't have to be the bad guy, but you do have to be the firm guy, right? You have to stick to something, and you have to hold your tenants accountable for things. That's really the big difference. You can still be empathetic and warm and considerate to your tenants and hear them out, but you have to be firm, and you have to stick to your guns. And whatever path you choose to take, you got to go take that path. Just make sure it's the right one and stick to it.
That's excellent advice. I love that.
So Dave, thank you so much for making time to be our guest today. It was a pleasure interviewing you.
Thanks so much, guys. It was great talking to both of you. A lot of great questions. Hopefully it was helpful and insightful to your audience.
Totally. Definitely will be. Thanks so much.